Hello, everyone. Our next session builds on the overarching theme of innovation in clinical trials. Session 2 will explore facilitating the environment for innovation, and more specifically, how we're modernizing the clinical trial process to accommodate innovation in the oncology drug pipeline. A reminder to our audience to submit questions throughout the session. We're aiming to have a 10-minute Q&A at the end of this session, so we'd love to have as many questions as possible. Let me now introduce our panel. Dr. Roxana Alexa joined Health Canada in 2007, and for the past 9 years, she has managed diverse clinical review teams in the Office of Clinical Trials, Therapeutic Products Directorate. She oversees the activities related to the review and authorization of clinical trial applications across a broad range of therapeutic areas, including for oncology drugs. Susan Marlin is the President and CEO of Clinical Trials Ontario, an organization established by the province of Ontario to make Ontario a preferred location for clinical trials while maintaining the highest ethical standards. She is currently a member of the Life Sciences Ontario Board of Directors and the management team for the Ontario SPORE, or Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Support Unit. Patrick Sullivan is a passionate childhood cancer advocate and past chair of the board of the Childhood Cancer Canada and one of the founders of the Team Finn Foundation. Patrick participates in several national and international initiatives that include ACORN, advocacy for Canadian Children Oncology Research Network, and he is one of the founders of this organization. By profession, Patrick is a securities and corporate commercial litigator. This panel will be led by Dr. Stephanie Michaud, President and CEO of BioCan. Dr. Michaud has been a chair of this conference since inception now 5 years ago, and we are very grateful for the energy and insight she brings to this important event. BioCan RX, a not-for-profit organization that seeks to accelerate the delivery of innovative immunotherapies from the bench to the bedside, Stephanie brings over 20 years of public, government, and private sector experience in research and innovation policy. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here from my home in Western Quebec, and I hope that you've enjoyed the conference so far. We have an absolutely fantastic panel for you today, which is going to speak to modernization in clinical trials and why this is important. The different representatives assembled in this panel really represent different sectors and have very unique points of view when it comes to clinical trials and their delivery and how to make this entire process more efficient overall and more innovative to respond to our new drug pipeline that is producing a number of different products. Our first speaker in this panel will be Patrick Sullivan of Team Finn Foundation, followed by Susan Marlin of Clinical Trials Ontario, and then Dr. Roxana Alexa from Health Canada. At this time, I would like to turn this over to Patrick Sullivan for his presentation for this panel. Patrick.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to approach this from a patient advocate perspective and someone who's experienced cancer through my family and not me directly. And from my talk, what I'm going to focus on is clinical trial innovation in an age of precision. And modernization is part of that, but I've focused it around innovation. You see on my opening slide just some of the different initiatives I'm involved in, but I'm going to go to the next slide. And I come to this world because my son was diagnosed with rhabdomyosarcoma in 2007, and doctors ran out of treatments for him, and there was nothing left in 2008 when the cancer came back. So I look at the need for innovation from someone who desperately would have liked to have seen it in 2008 when we were told our son was palliative. And From a pediatric oncology lens, some of the particular items, which aren't necessarily unique, they might just be more expressed, is historically it can be hard to get pharma engaged. There's a limited number of eligible children for clinical trials. Funding issues, contracts, Health Canada, REBs. We typically have small studies, small networks. And the issue of experimental nomenclature, which means that if there is a promising clinical trial in another jurisdiction, from a regulatory perspective, you can't get access to it because it's quote unquote experimental. And the clinical trial infrastructure that informs all of this and all of what we're talking about has been built on the notions of safety and efficacy. And I think I want to spend a little bit of time just building that out and explaining where that came from based on some of the research and reading I've done. So just to level set, and as most who will be attending this will know, phase 1 is a real focus on the safety component, right? What's the maximum tolerated dose? What's the recommended dose for phase 2, assuming you get through the phase 1? Phase 2 looks more at efficacy and does the treatment work. And phase 3 gets you into, is it better than what's already out there? And from a historical perspective, these things just weren't plucked from the air. There's a historical reason they exist. Prior to the 1930s, safety and efficacy were not part of the FDA. It had a limited mandate in what it did. And in the 1930s, we saw the introduction of the sulfa drugs, which were in advance of the antibiotics, and they worked quite marvelously for infections, or at least certain types of infections. And there was an effort in the US to try and get a suspension that would get to kids. And that led to sulfa drugs being suspended in antifreeze. And when that was distributed by the manufacturer, it led to a number of deaths, including Jan Nidifer, who is the young girl you see here. And Jan Nidifer's mother wrote to her senator to talk about their experience. And she happened to get on the radar screen of a senator who was looking to modernize, in the 1930s, and had running into all kinds of problems in doing so. And so it was out of the back of the sulfidamide scandal that we have safety coming into the regulatory structure. And then efficacy comes out of thalidomide in the 1960s. And the 1962 Act led directly from what happened with thalidomide and the efforts of Francis Kelsey, who, as you may or may not know, is a Canadian, who worked at the FDA during the sulfamide issues in the 1930s and was leading the FDA and fought hard to keep thalidomide off the shelves and out of patients in the US. And her efforts led to her getting all kinds of press. And out of that, we have efficacy come in and all of the things that come out of efficacy. So there's an author named Gao who talks about our basic approach to clinical trials and the conduct of research and approval of investigational drugs was born in scandal and reared in protectionism. So, I've thought a lot about these issues and read in terms of innovation. And something I've read recently that's really struck me is a book by Safi Bahcall, who we hear all the time about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what he talks about very eloquently is how structure eats culture for lunch. And if we want innovation and if we want to affect change, we have to pay attention to what the structure is, and culture can follow or will follow structure. So that's a way I've started to think about innovation. And here's an example of how regulatory structure impacts the cultural approach. And there's something that still sort of burns me, this notion of the therapeutic misconception. And you'll see on the slide there's a definition of therapeutic misconception, but essentially it's this belief that the purpose of a clinical trial is to benefit the patient when really it's there to gather data for the purpose of contributing to scientific knowledge. Now, the problem I have with that is I think it's built on a fundamental misconception of human nature. Everyone who participates in clinical trials, who advocates for clinical trials, who develops therapies that go into clinical trials, wants it to work, right? They expect some benefit. They hope for some benefit. right? There's a science that doesn't negate the scientific process, but the therapeutic misconception forgets why people are there in the first place. And I say that therapeutic misconception comes out of the structure that we've built on safety and efficacy. And I want to be clear, safety and efficacy are critically important. That's not my point. So there's an author named Simon Sinek who talks about the golden circle, right? And the center of the circle is why. Why are we doing something? And then we look at how we do it. And then we look at what we do, right? But start with why. And what I think we're doing in terms of how we've structured clinical trials and what we need to focus on if we want to innovate effectively is stop confusing the how with the why, right? What is our purpose, right? That's the why. Why are we doing something, right? We didn't develop COVID-19 vaccines to make sure they were safe and efficacious. We developed them to deal with a pandemic, right? Because people were dying. How we developed them was through clinical trials. We wanted to make sure they were safe, but that's not the why, right? And for me, the why comes back to Finn, right? In 2008, when he was palliative, we had an opportunity to access treatment in the US that was not curative. Cryotherapy, it helped shrink his tumors. It helped get us back for him, get Finn back for us for a time, right? That wasn't a clinical trial. I would have loved if it was, because there would have been data points, there would have been information gathered about how cryotherapy can be used. But even if it was a clinical trial, my why still would have been focused on Finn, not on the therapeutic misconception. And here we see plots, survival plots of various pediatric diseases, right? The why we're doing clinical trials is to do better, right? These kids are dying. Rhabdomyosarcoma, 5-year survival rate if you have refractory disease is basically 0. So my view is if we want innovation, if we want modernization, if we want to change paradigms, which are all things I want, we have to bring the why back into the discussion. And one way we're doing that in the pediatric oncology with very sort of a cooperation and open discussion with the regulators is viewing pediatric oncology as an ideal place to build an innovation sandbox. This safe space where we can try and innovate to figure out how we bring why back into the system. And my view of how to do that is we take safety, we take efficacy, and we keep them because they're fundamental, but we add access. And we remember that a critical reason we are trying to innovate is that we're giving access to better treatments. And if you focus on access as one of the 3 legs of the stool of why we're doing things, I think that structure will help to drive the form that changes the culture and enables the innovation. So, that's the through line, and we're hoping to build an innovation sandbox around pediatric oncology that accomplishes that. Happy to talk about that more later offline, but at this point, I'd like to pass the virtual baton to Susan Marlin, who I've known for some time. She's going to talk to you about logistical and regulatory burden in this context of innovation and modernization and some other things. So I'm looking forward to hearing her talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I'm coming at this from 2 different perspectives today. One is my work with Clinical Trials Ontario. We're a provincial group. And Clinical Trials Ontario really focuses on providing supports for researchers, sponsors, and patient groups across the province that are involved with clinical trials. And we really focus on 2 different things. One of the main things that we focus on is ensuring that trials get started as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And Patrick's mentioned access, and that is one of the things we try to focus on is how do we make sure that trials come to Canada, that they come to Ontario, and that our patients have access to the therapies that are provided as part of clinical trials. We all know this. There's not enough time ever to get treatments to the market, and especially in pediatric oncology and many other diseases. There's not enough time to get the research done. and the treatments proven to be effective and safe, and there's definitely not enough money to get this done. So that's what we try to do at Clinical Trials Ontario, is focus on that efficiency. So that's one perspective that I bring to the table today. The other is as an investigator on a CHR-funded grant. It's called the CHEER Project. And the CHEER Project is focused, well, I should back up and say we're conducting the CHEER Project in partnership with MyCERN, which is the Maternal, Infant, Child, Youth Research Network. So CTO has partnered with this child research network. And really what we're trying to do, and it may sound simple, but it's really proving not to be, is achieving a single research ethics review for pediatric or child health research across Canada. And for many of the reasons which Patrick has already talked about, the studies tend to be small, involve a small number of patients. To be successful in Canada, they need to be activated at hospitals and institutions across the country. And when we look at trying to get a research ethics review at every single one of these sites, for one thing, we see a lot of variety in what the results from those ethics reviews are. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of resource, not just from our REBs, but from our investigators to do the same thing, basically anywhere from 10 to 15 or more times across the country. So, when I think back over the last year and a half, over the COVID last year and a half, the COVID 18 months, it's been really interesting. Certainly, I would say primarily from a CTO perspective, what we've seen. So we have seen trials getting started more quickly than we've ever seen them be started before, and mostly COVID-focused trials. So what we've seen from a regulatory agency, Health Canada, and Roxana will talk about this a lot more, is we've seen regulatory reform in real time to accommodate clinical trials being able to start faster. We've seen our REB approvals be conducted more quickly than we've ever seen them before, some of them within days. We've seen institutions do what they need to do to get trials started more quickly. We've also seen what I would call unprecedented levels of cooperation, of flexibility, and much more of a focus on the beneficiaries of the research. Like during this pandemic, how do we get things started quickly because it actually really, really matters. Of course, the other thing that we've seen is an evolution in terms of how trials are done, a lot more decentralized clinical trials activity, and I know that's being talked about in other parts of this conference. So when I think about modernizing and what we might be able to do going forward, one of the things I should note is already in Ontario, we do have a single research ethics review for multi-site clinical trials. We have other provinces that do this as well very well, such as Quebec. But what we've not been successful in doing is doing this across the country. So we see I'm not sure I would call them provincial barriers. There are some legislative barriers that stop us from getting that done. I mean, what we really want is one ethics review done once and done very well. Patrick mentioned culture and strategy, and I think this is one of those cases where culture does eat strategy for breakfast. And although we have the infrastructure to get this done. Like we actually have everything we need. We have this system built. We have a way to make sure our REBs are operating at a quality that they can do one review and do it well for the rest of the country. We just don't quite, I would say, have the structure or maybe the lack of barriers and structures to make this happen across the country. So I'm really hopeful that some of the collaborative spirit we've seen over the last year and a half, some of the flexibility that we've seen over the last year and a half, just the increased focus on beneficiaries and getting things done, getting them done well, and getting them done quickly will spill over into the future. Again, we're sort of at this point now where we can have what we need to do those singles reviews, but we are at the point of changing the culture and changing people's minds about, getting this done. So I will stop there and hand it over to Roxana. Thank you, Roxana.
Hello. Thank you, Susan, and thank you for inviting me to today's panel discussion. I was asked to comment a little bit about why do I think Health Canada is committed to the modernization of clinical trial regulations, and perhaps comment about the changes that I have seen in clinical trials as part of the drug development process. So, well, I will first start by emphasizing Health Canada's commitment to improving the health of Canadians. As you all know, Health Canada is responsible for the regulation of clinical trials involving a wide range of products, including drugs, biologics, natural health products, and medical devices. Several years ago, our department started working on this huge project to renew our current regulatory framework. As a result, in 2019, Health Canada announced legislative changes to the Food and Drugs Act, Bill C-97. We were happy to also announce in May, May 20th this year, the launch of our clinical trial modernization paper for public consultation. Input was received by July 4th, and I hope some of the participants at today's conference took also the opportunity and provided input during the consultation period. So, why is Health Canada taking on this regulatory clinical trials legislative work? Well, we would like to have a Canadian regulatory framework that is agile and flexible to allow us to support access to innovative treatments, the adoption of new therapies in the healthcare system, and does not inadvertently stifle innovation that could improve the health of Canadians. We also want to provide Canadians with greater opportunities to participate in a broader range of clinical trials. We know that in Canada, clinical trials are mostly run by sites affiliated with academic research centers, and that there are fewer incentives for running clinical trials for pediatric drug development, for example, and for rare diseases. As you can also, and as you have also heard from our colleagues today. For many subsets of cancer patients or those diagnosed with rare diseases, the population is small and dispersed across Canada and globally. So I think that more has to be done to increase access to clinical trials in remote communities. But this is a huge project on which other colleagues in my department are actively working. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced the need for agility and innovation to get high-demand products to Canadians quickly without compromising safety. The protection of clinical study participants is paramount, and this shared responsibility, sponsors, CRO, qualified investigators, clinical trial staff, research ethics boards, and the regulator, Health Canada. We are all in it together. So I think that the proposed regulatory changes would help enable safe and agile oversight over the different types of innovative trials that are becoming more common, while continuing to prioritize patient safety. Moreover, consulting with patients is essential. In my opinion, it helps support the design of trials that are suitable for patient needs. As our understanding of cancer biology continues to evolve, clinical trial designs will need to evolve as well. It is recognized the standard paradigm for drug development from phase 1 through phase 3 resulted in long duration of development from bench to market authorization to the bedside, and high rate of phase 3 failures have been reported. So this resulted in large number of patients being exposed to ineffective therapies and wasted resources. It has been probably 15 years ago when Health Canada received clinical trial applications from industry and academic cancer research consortiums from US and Canada, for example, for the early phase drug development, where innovative methods were proposed to help identify the minimum effective dose and the maximum tolerated dose. Then we saw the drug development slowly embracing the so-called target therapies, the biomarker-driven research, and the emerging clinical safety, tolerability, and the PK/PD data for these products appear to signal that it was possible in some cases to shift from the standard 3+3 dose-finding design that you might be familiar with to the more innovative so-called adaptive dose escalation, dose finding designs. It did not take long for the industry and academia to thankfully embrace and promote the so-called adaptive seamless phase 1/2 or phase 1b/2. These are trials that integrate the dose escalation designs for finding the recommended phase 2 dose in combination with expansion cohorts, for example, allowing to collect and answer further the tolerability, the preliminary efficacy, and as well the collection of additional PK/PD data at the selected recommended phase 2 dose and schedule. More recently, as a result of the work done and the workshops organized by the US FDA, we have seen more and more stakeholders planning their early phase trials to identify not just the maximum tolerated dose, but to find the optimal dose level to be used in the larger phase 2 or phase 3 confirmatory trials. In this manner, I think we have good reasons to believe that stakeholders will increase the chances of success of their confirmatory trials. Proper dose selection will reduce the likelihood of drug discontinuation during the trial, will spare participants from significant toxicities, and they will be able to remain on trials, truly benefiting from the drug development program. We have also received numerous applications using the adaptive seamless phase 2/3 and master protocols. The audience might be familiar with the master protocols, also called basket trials, umbrella trials, platform trials. In general, master protocols are designed with multiple sub-studies and involve evaluation of one or more investigational products in one or more disease subtypes within an overall trial structure. For the past 3 years or so, we also noticed an increased number of oncology trials using different, I would say more complex, innovative designs, the so-called modular or multi-modular designs. The applications include core study protocol and multiple modules that have module-specific study protocols. Each module is to be used in conjunction with the core protocol. It is generally preferred that the recommended phase 2 dose be known for the investigational product if the sponsor chooses to use multi-modular designs. In fact, most of the applications with multi-modular designs in Canada were in phase 2 of the drug development for products that were in the phase 2 of the drug development. However, occasionally we have received multi-modular applications with independent modules following a seamless phase 1b/2 design. Remember, these were kind of the trials where we are targeting to identify the optimal dose level and schedule. So in conclusion, increasingly complex and personalized products, clinical interventions, I think will shift how the regulatory framework might best manage risk. new use of technology and data could also change how trials are conducted in Canada and globally. I would say that innovations in clinical trial design were needed to overcome costs, recruitment challenges, increase access to innovative treatments, just to name few of the reasons. They all warrant new regulatory agilities over the life cycle of the product. I would also like to take a moment and let the audience know that Canada has been considered a preferred country for the conduct of global clinical trials. Canadian clinicians and scientists have been acknowledged for their contributions in the oncology drug development. Health Canada, as regulatory body, will continue to work collaboratively with all stakeholders and promote good clinical research. I think the future is for global clinical trials rather than opening multiple regional trials that would compete in enrolling and slow down the progress of clinical research. I can see that in the near future, trial designs that integrate emerging concepts such as comprehensive molecular profiling, machine learning, some established multimodality treatments, and even real-world data will be critical to the care of patients with cancer. Thus, we will continue our successful collaboration with industry, academia, and other international regulatory agencies as part of the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals and Human Use, the so-called ICH. I'm currently working in collaboration with a senior colleague who has great expertise in biostatistics on the new adaptive clinical trials, ICH E20. This is a guideline on the design, conduct, analysis, and interpretation of adaptive clinical trials, with the goal of providing a transparent and harmonized set of principles for the regulatory review of these studies in a global drug development program. We hope that the principles outlined there will provide the flexibility to evaluate, discuss innovative approaches to clinical trial design throughout the development process. However, there are other ICH guidelines that have been in progress, for which work is in progress or work has just been completed. So I invite the audience to search on the ICH website for more details. Overall, I think that by modernizing the clinical trial regulations, industry and academics will benefit from flexible, clear, and predictable regulatory requirements and streamlined approaches. There will be greater public access to clinical trial information, and trial participants will benefit from improved safety monitoring. Patient advocacy groups should be involved early on by the industry and academics to ensure that patient input is considered when selecting among the different scientific clinical research hypotheses when defining the study endpoints. That is probably more important than ever in the context of global, multi-center, multi-site clinical trials, where it is reasonable to expect differences in the treatment options available to patients across the globe, thus differences in what constitutes standard of care. I will stop here and I will welcome any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Roxana, and Susan and Patrick, for all of your insightful comments. Before I launch into the questions that I've jotted down here for all of you, I wanted to pass the baton to the panelists to see if you had any questions to ask, follow-on questions to ask of each other. So I will pass that to you right now. Any questions? No? Okay.
I do have one, if that's
okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Susan.
Yeah. So Patrick, I really appreciate you bringing up therapeutic misconception and talking about that and your perspective on that. My experience has been from the research ethics world that's almost an indisputable concept that therapeutic misconception is a bad thing. And we have to do everything that we can to avoid it. So I guess one of the things that I would ask is, especially if you were in that community with, the research ethics boards and speaking to them about that issue, how would you encourage a different perspective on that?
I think I would probably do two things. The first I would say is you have to understand that when you or someone you love has been diagnosed with cancer, or you've got a palliative, or things are not going well, or let's just go back right to initial diagnosis, you are immediately immersed into a world of uncertainty, right? When Finn was diagnosed, we were told he has a 70% chance of survival. And we're going to use vincristine, actinomycin, cyclophosphamide in an effort to cure him. I didn't care about 70%. I just wanted them to do what they needed to do to fix him, right? When you have a broken arm, they put a cast on, and you are certain it's going to heal. Sometimes it doesn't, but it pretty much does most of the time. But when you've got cancer, it's by definition uncertain, right? And your type of cancer, your stage of diagnosis changes the level of uncertainty. So all that happens when you get to palliative stage in clinical trials is you're measuring a different degree of uncertainty. We are very uncertain about the potential benefits. We have a scientific belief for why it's going to happen. So I'd say that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is be a patient, right? I've read articles or books by people who are ethicists who suddenly become patients, and it changes your perspective, right? You cannot think as a patient where I've been told treatment has failed and I'm looking for other options. I'm happy to contribute to science, but I'm not thinking about science. And you can give me a consent form and you can tell me all the things in the world you want. I'm still thinking about the hope, the possibility, the hope of a cure, the hope of time, right? And so the therapeutic misconception tries to bring this automatized notion of we're going to compartmentalize. It doesn't exist in the real world. So it's a non-functioning concept in my mind.
Thank you.
Sorry, I feel quite strongly about that, Susan.
No, you do. By the way, it's a refreshing perspective to hear. I think it's very valuable. Thank you.
I think as well that knowing the perspective of the patient is important when designing the protocol, basically, because we still want to provide some therapeutic benefits to patients, even if there is, a slim glimpse. We need to do a proper research that still balances the potential therapeutic benefit with the uncertainty about the toxicity as well. From every stage of development, from each stage of development, I think, in my opinion, we should strive to design properly even our early phases, where there is not much hope on therapeutic benefit because we are just learning about how the product will perform in a human being. But if we strive there to use innovative methods, probably we will use fewer patients, fewer participants will experience, the toxicities or uncertainties about how these drugs perform in regards to the anti-tumor effect. So there is work that we can do collaboratively, researchers, patients, scientists, and biostatisticians, industry with huge experience in this field. They can put their heads together and we can improve, so we can allow a little bit more hope even for therapeutic benefit in the early phases.
Thank you, Roxana.
At least this is my opinion. I don't know how feasible it is. I mean, it's very hard. It involves a lot from the part of the stakeholders. You really need very experienced biostatisticians, for example, those who really know how to use these innovative Bayesian designs and Bayesian methodologies and modified Bayesian methodologies, or those who have experience in interpreting and running simulations of the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics effect for the drugs in development, so we can start on the right foot with the doses in clinical trial. There is a lot of cost there, but I think is money worth spent.
Thank you. A little bit of a question for Patrick, but Susan, because you utilized one of Patrick's quotes with respect to the breakfast and lunch analogy, right? And what I saw in your description with respect to a national REB and the barriers that exist is that issue of structure eating culture for lunch. You mentioned that there are provinces that Ontario, for example, and Quebec, but if you were able to push forward on this national approval process for a national REB, you've mentioned legislative barriers. Are there any other structural issues that would need to be addressed in order to move that forward?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Stephanie. And by the way, I should note that Patrick and I did meet many, many years ago, and he came to our offices in Toronto. This was long before the CHEER CIHR grant existed, which is trying to achieve a single research ethics review across the country. And I think I remember him saying, why don't we do one ethics review, and how can we get that done? And so we've been thinking about this and wanting it to happen for a long time. So I mentioned we've worked out the infrastructure. So when we talk about structure, like we have all the infrastructure, we have all the know-how, like we know exactly how to do this. So if we put aside the legislative issues, and by the way, the legislation, some of the provincial legislation, we're very hopeful that it will change in future. That's not going to be easy, but that's one of the things that we as a community, including patient advocacy groups and researchers and others, we need to work collectively to make this happen. If you remove the legislative barriers, it's really, I mean, I don't want to minimize it, but it's a matter of people changing their minds and agreeing that it can be done differently. And they might have to eat a little bit of change, and I don't minimize that change, doesn't take work and doesn't take thought and doesn't take care. But I come back to the examples in Quebec. In Quebec, the single research ethics review was mandated for multi-site clinical trials. In Ontario, it wasn't mandated, it's completely voluntary. And I think now we have 110 hospitals across the province that have signed up to do this. Every single one of them had to, within the walls of that independent institution, figure out a way to make it work for them. And they did do that for sort of the bigger picture and the greater good. Now, one thing that we do have provincially, and this comes back to culture again, let's arguably say Ontario is an Ontario and Quebec is Quebec, and there aren't really turf wars within those provinces, or within each of those provinces, although there probably is in some ways. But whether we like it or not, politics seeps into this somehow as well. And Canada, our healthcare system is, healthcare is provided provincially. A lot, I think, of what we're suffering from when it comes to things like a single REB review, we also experience in healthcare and having data shareable across provinces and accessible across the country and these sorts of things. So I would say it's changing minds, being to eat or deal with that change that, is, you have to push through it and you have to figure things out. But I think there is that third, let's call it political, cultural issue that, by the way, researchers and patients and their families, they don't see it and they don't care. They want this to be done. They don't see it and they don't care. So part of what we're thinking about is how do we elevate those voices to convince, others that do care about those things that it's time we get over it. It's just time. By the way, Patrick, I'm passionate about that issue.
Yes, which is great. I think this is another exemplar of what I was trying to get at in terms of the structure, though, and I think that's shown very well by what Susan has to say, because the conceptual model of the modern research ethic board sort of enterprise came out of thalidomide in 1962. That structure didn't exist pre that, right? You see it come in because we need to be safe, we need to be efficacious, we need to make sure we're doing this in the right way. But if you start from the proposition of access should be a part of this, right? Yes, we need to be safe. Yes, we need to be efficacious, but we need to maximize access. And right now, this balkanized system is harming access. So if you go back to the why are we doing this? So we can get patients to this more quickly. That, I don't pretend that makes anything Susan is talking about as easy. It doesn't, but it starts you in a different mind frame right from the very beginning. We need to drive access better, and these solutions are intended to do that while maintaining safety and efficacy as central components.
Yeah.
Definitely,
Well
I agree with you. Patrick and Susan, indeed, well said. And this probably will encourage more researchers or more clinicians to join to the research, to become, participants as qualified investigators. And, there are certain incentives that come with this streamlining of research ethics board and regulatory work that we are envisioning here. I'm really hopeful that these new changes will stimulate further the research in Canada. We will remain at the forefront of clinical research. I have no doubt. Canadians are very well known for the good quality data that they produce. Canadians as participants in clinical trials are really giving their time, sometimes, at the expense of their families, to contribute to the innovation, to the progress of drug development.
Thank you, Roxana. Patrick, I have a question for you, and it has to do with the last slide that you showed, which was, to me, it looked like, and correct me if I'm wrong, looked like the regulatory sandbox.
Yeah.
So,
correct.
What would you like to see there? What kind of project would you be?
I've changed the language to innovation sandbox because I think that's less threatening to people. And what we're working on right now is towards a meeting in the spring to answer the very question you're asking. What we want to do is build a straw dog innovation sandbox, bring Health Canada, bring industry, bring patient advocates, bring clinicians all into a room and say, here's what we've designed as a straw dog approach. What do we knock out? What do we bring in? And what does that mean in terms of tweaks in regulatory structure, if any? What does that mean in terms of tweaks of, I don't just want it to be, how does Health Canada innovate? I want it to be, how does the structure of what we do innovate? So the short answer is I'm not sure yet, but we're currently looking for sand and filling it up as a starting point. So.
Thank you for that. We have 23 seconds, and I may get into a little bit of trouble, but I really must ask this question of you, Roxana, and I don't know that you'll have an answer for me, but here goes. In a lot of the conversations that we're hearing right throughout the pandemic, especially now that we see this light at the end of the tunnel, everybody is patting themselves on the back with respect to what we did right, and the changes that have come, with rolling reviews, for example, were really important in the last meeting that I was in. So this notion of maintaining momentum in order to make the requisite changes, I think everybody's feeling this kind of urgency. This conference as well, we have a session on the life science sector and discussing what's the future, what's next. There are a number of strategy documents. The government has made investments. But with respect to timelines, with respect to the regular modernizing clinical trials, are you able to approximate or share with us, in your opinion, the timeline that you're looking at, or is it that the doors have been open and innovation in clinical trial delivery will always be central to the mission of Health Canada?
I do not have the answer to it. As you can imagine, this will be a policy discussion. As per our consultation paper, we kind of looked for input from different stakeholders. We will take into consideration the input received, and we will try to develop some timelines, probably through policy. However, don't quote me on this because I'm not really at the forefront of this work. We have other teams working on it. To my knowledge, we will try to facilitate as much as possible access to clinical trials, access to innovative drugs. We will remain competitive. We will continue to remain competitive in terms of review timelines and everything else that comes with the regulatory work that we do.
So thank you very much, everybody, for that fascinating conversation and for your insights and sharing all that you know with each other and with this audience. At this point of time, I'd like to pass it back to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie?
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you for your very expert facilitation of that panel and a tremendous amount of information on facilitating the environment for change. Thank you also to Roxana, to Susan, and to Patrick. We're going to go now to audience questions. A reminder to everybody that to direct their questions to the specific person you'd like to answer that question if possible. If not, we'll ask it generally and just pass it through and let whoever feels most capable and best to answer that question. So we'll wait for a moment. In the meantime, Stephanie, I do know that you have one question that we did not get time to ask the panel regarding the future. So perhaps we can start with that while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And welcome back, everybody. It's great to see you all again. And the question that I have for you, again, since we're talking about modernization of clinical trials, is really a future-scaping question, if I can say, about what the future looks like from the perspective of your organization. So we've been talking about modernizing clinical trials, and I would like to give you a situational question where it's 2030. You have been working for the past decade on modernizing clinical trials, implementing your vision, working through your different organizations. And so it is the age-old question: what does success look like for your organizations, and what do you see looking back in your future self at 2030? Who wants to kick us off?
I can,
Well,
if that's helpful.
Sure, go ahead, Susan.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephanie. So in thinking about that, and again, thinking about what we think about a lot, which is starting trials really quickly and really efficiently, and being able to enroll as many interested and eligible people that we can across the country in our if I look forward to 2013, it wouldn't be particular to our organization, but we would have something in place in Canada so that no matter where you are, you can find out about the trials that are happening, and that it's really quick and easy for those trials to be started and to be run wherever you are, to the extent that's possible. I know it's not possible, because of the complicated treatment that's involved in many trials, for them to happen always outside of the traditional treatment centers. But I would love to see just a quick, activation across the country of studies that would allow people to both find them and enter them quickly.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Who would like to go next?
If I may add,
yes.
I will go next because my vision just ties in with Suzanne's vision. I trust that 10 years from now, Canada will do even better than we are doing now. It came to my attention that a report of Canada's economic strategy tables for health and biosciences ranks Canada 4th among the global health and biosciences hubs. So I do see with the changes that we started to initiate today, and will continue with baby steps or larger steps in the next 10 years, that Canada will do even better. And we are well positioned to be among the top 3 preferred countries for clinical trials. Based on the ongoing collaborative work that we see happening today with all the regulatory agencies, the US FDA, Europe, UK, Swissmedic, Singapore, Australia, just to name a few of them, and with the cancer consortiums, patient advocates group, and the industry. So is where I see the future is for Canada.
Thank you for that. Patrick. Oh, you're on mute, Patrick.
The same.
Oh, there you go.
Am I muted?
Oh, now we can hear you.
Okay. So it's a variation on the same theme, Stephanie, and to understand where I'd like to be in 2030, understand where I was in 2008 when we were told that in a follow-up routine MRI that Finn's cancer was back and there were no treatment options left. So if it's 2030 and I happen to be in a similar situation with a grandchild, I'd like to be in a place where they say, you know what, the cancer is back, but you remember we did that sequencing when you first came in, and we found this marker, and there's a clinical trial available in the UK that's in phase 2, an immunotherapy clinical trial that's really promising for sarcomas. And you know what, you're not going to have to go to the UK. We have this process that we can streamline, that we can get you access to that clinical trial here, now, and have this additional opportunity, and we think we can get that up and running in about a month.
Thank you for that response. It's all of you really inspiring, and working together, working collaboratively, I have no doubt that we will achieve these goals. Very inspired responses. Thank you.
May I finish, Stephanie, with one question from the audience? It's interesting. Many of the questions that have been asked, you've all done beautifully in answering so far. So there is one on the table, and I'm afraid it's a slightly large one, but I think it's a very important one because it's come up several times, several themes. And it is the concept of solving the inequities in access to clinical trials. This particularly was one of Greg Simon's most important points, the issue of inequities, and that means many different things. So if I could frame the question and say, in the next year, with the thought of putting solutions to inequitable access to clinical trials on the table, is there one or two things that can be done to move this conversation forward? We can maybe just go quickly around the room, and Stephanie, I'll let you have the final word on that.
Sure.
Roxana, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. I would just want to let the audience know that we are already doing something about it in collaboration, obviously, as I mentioned, with other regulatory agencies. We do promote broader recruitment and broader representation of all the ethnic groups without discriminating on age or race and ethnicity. This was all the time present in our regulatory framework, but unfortunately wasn't always properly applied during the clinical trials. So we are taking steps to ensure that we encourage recruitment by limiting, certain challenges. For example, in Canada, to have sites open in remote areas, I could see that probably our framework could allow for virtual clinical sites, and this, I think, would contribute greatly to a broader eligibility criteria, which will include a diversity in terms of age, race, ethnicity.
Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, so, I think there are many pieces to this. I would start by suggesting we really don't have enough data to even fully understand how important this issue is in Canada. We've always shied away from collecting a lot of data, including race, and I think that needs to change quite quickly. So I think we need to understand the issue. I think we need to figure out how to broaden our reach and catchment area for clinical trials, whether it be rural people, racialized, immigrants, disabled people. I don't think we've done a very good job at that. And then when we do reach these populations, I think there are issues of literacy that are significant, and also issues of, especially when we look at immigrants, where they come from and how they would even view research in the first place, and how we, as people recruiting or bringing people to trials, can even put ourselves in their lives to understand what they need to understand to make decisions around trials. I think it's multifaceted, and I think it's a huge problem. But again, advocate for data, certainly to start.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. Thank you. Patrick?
So I'll go back to the through line of my presentation. I think we need to embed access as the why of the structure, right, along with safety and efficacy. And if your starting point is we should be doing well on access, then automatically you need to solve the problem of inequity in access, because the purpose is access. And if you're not doing that, and how we're not doing that, you started with why, and then you can figure out all kinds of how, including the data collection to tell you where those problems are. And I agree very much with Roxana that before a excellent starting point, and we're already doing some of it, is remote access, right? How do we bring the trials to the patients and not just bring patients to the trials?
Yes, certainly a theme also in other sessions of this conference. Stephanie, you have the last word as the panel chair.
Well, great, fantastic discussion. And on the subject of this question, there are a number of very interesting initiatives that are getting started in Canada with respect to increasing catchment areas and looking at this question about access. One of them is the CRAFT initiative, which is onboarding hospitals as satellite sites to clinical trials to do exactly that, to reach out to rural and remote clinical trial participants. But I think the job here is even bigger. We need to have a conversation about clinical trials being part of care, right, as being an option for care in Canada. And that means letting people know that these options exist, but then also encouraging doctors to have conversations about clinical trials with their patients. So all of the points that have been named here with respect to how we define the eligibility criteria, the absolute requisite requirement for data, Susan, you're spot on. The data that exists with respect to diversity in clinical trials, the data we looked at is from the US, and there is no data, to the best of my knowledge, in Canada. And Patrick, access as the driver makes a lot of sense. So on that note, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Colorectal Cancer for hosting this really incredible panel, and for all of you, your participation and your incredible insights based on the organizations from which you helm and your great expertise in the area. It's been a real pleasure to spend this past hour with you.
Yeah, and for your beautiful facilitation, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone. We're going to take a 5-minute break and then come on back for our next session.